Hello everyone. In this week's brief little lecture video, we're going to be talking about some of the specific components of your upcoming commemorative speech, specifically in terms of this manuscript form of speaking, this written style versus oral style, and then a couple of other stylistic considerations as well. So throughout the entire semester, one of the main things, which for many people this was a point of annoyance, for many people it was just kind of a challenge to kind of work through, was finding this right balance between writing a manuscript and writing an outline. I know for many of us coming into a public speaking class, our initial goal, our initial kind of tendency is to want to write out a word-for-word script of everything that we're going to say, which is kind of what a manuscript actually is. However, what we've been trying to do for every other speech this semester at the very least is write an outline where we're only having kind of, here's the main points, and it gives you kind of a little more freedom and flexibility to adapt on the fly in the middle of your speech, depending on how your audience is reacting. Well, for this final speech, we're going to actually be using manuscript delivery, meaning that the manuscript that you are working from is going to be a word-for-word copy of your speech, exactly how you're going to give it. For a lot of people, this actually seems like it's going to be an easier form of speaking. I mean, after all, the speech is there in front of you. There's no chance of you forgetting it. But like we're going to talk about a little bit today, this can actually be one of the most challenging forms of public speaking for a variety of reasons. So in this little video, we're going to talk about some reasons that manuscripts are good, some of the challenges that come up. I'll give you a couple of different strategies to plan and prepare your manuscript, and then we'll wrap up by talking about a couple of just broad commemorative stylistic devices overall. So first things first, just like anything that we're doing in a public speaking situation, you don't want to be giving a speech a certain way just because you feel like it. Everything should be purposeful, matching your speaking to that particular situation in that audience. So with that in mind, there are several reasons why it actually does make sense to use a manuscript that can be really advantageous and help you with what you're trying to do. So, for instance, if you are giving a speech that requires really detailed or exact information, so for instance, maybe you're a public health official and you want to give us specific facts and figures about an ongoing situation, you don't want to be kind of pulling those numbers off the top of your head. If you are directly quoting what someone else said, you don't want to give yourself the chance to accidentally kind of misphrase it or remember the quote incorrectly. Manuscripts are also useful if you are a prominent public figure and you know that this speech is going to be scrutinized, archived, referred to later. So for instance, if you are, say, the president or a mayor or the leader of a big company, having a permanent written record of all your remarks can be really beneficial for a variety of reasons, whether that's for your historical impact, whether that's just so that the company has a record of everything that has been decided. Having that exact written transcript can be really valuable. On a similar note, if you know it's going to be published later, so let's say you go on and become, a popular TED Talk speaker, or you're giving, all these great presentations, and you know that you want to put it online or publish it out in the world later, having that written version can be helpful just to kind of have on hand. And then finally, this is what's really helpful for our specific purposes. If you know that this speech really needs to have a very particular mood to it. So when we were talking, at the beginning of the semester doing, say, our informative speeches, the overall tone that we're trying to do is just convey information. It's pretty easy to adapt that on the fly. But if, say, you're talking at, a graduation ceremony and you want to really hit this celebratory mood, it's kind of helpful to have everything kind of written out and planned out so that way you know that you're hitting those exact notes. Kind of on the other side of things, let's say you're talking at, a memorial service for a family member. If you are kind of speaking off the cuff, that can be, appropriate in certain settings. But if you really want to create a certain, reflective or somber mood, having everything written out in advance can be helpful. So these are all reasons that it might be beneficial to you to choose to use a manuscript over an outline or over, impromptu speaking perhaps. And so even though this entire semester we've kind of tried to stray away from it, we're kind of shifting gears here, doing a bit of a 180 and pointing out that there are a lot of places where this does actually make sense. That said, even though, using a full written out manuscript might fit the situation that you're in, there's all sorts of extra challenges that come up. So that's not to say that you should never do a manuscript, but just know that if you are going to have everything written out, there might be some extra considerations that you need to think through and plan and work through as you're preparing. The first one might seem obvious, but I think it is worth at least spending a little bit of time on, which is that the speech actually sounds written. Obviously, if you write everything out and then you just read it aloud, it's going to not quite have the same overall feel, that overall tone, as if you're kind of just speaking face-to-face to someone. We've touched on this a little bit previously in this semester, this difference between oral style and written style. Basically, the idea is that written style is when you write something and you know it's going to be read, you know that your reader is going to be able to go back, flip forward, kind of work through it on their own pace. We want to avoid written style when we're doing manuscript speaking. You want to really hit that oral style, make it still sound like you're speaking genuinely to someone in that moment and not necessarily reading off of something that's already been prepared, even if you are reading off of something that's already been prepared. And so kind of along that same note, just because something sounds really good when you're reading it on a piece of paper, when you speak it out loud, it suddenly doesn't quite work as well. There's all sorts of little moments of this. The one that always comes to mind for me is those weird quirks of English grammar where you'll have two words that double up, so like that, or he had this before, where you have two words and they're doubled up after each other, and technically, grammatically, it's correct, and if you're writing it out for someone to read, it probably works okay, but when you're speaking it out loud, it just sounds kind of a little bit off. Of course, that's not the only example, but there's all sorts of cases where just because something looks good on paper, it doesn't necessarily work in a spoken setting. This is the biggest challenge, this third point here. You need to be able to actually talk to the audience and not just read a piece of paper to them. And that's kind of really difficult to do when you have the piece of paper in front of you that has the entire speech on it. But remember, you still want to deliver the speech. You're still conveying information and conveying a particular mood, not just reading something to us. And so you want to really practice how you're delivering the speech, so keeping in mind all those other delivery techniques we've kind of focused on the entire semester, while also keeping your place on the manuscript. That can actually be really difficult. With the manuscript, you have a lot of words kind of densely packed together, and depending on how you actually prepare it, it can be really easy to lose your place, at least if you're not going to be looking down at it the entire time, which of course is going to limit the actual connection you have with the audience. So really what this means is that as you're planning and practicing your delivery, it's actually going to need probably more preparation than you did for an extemporaneous outline, just to kind of make sure the delivery of that manuscript is working very well. So with those challenges in mind, I want to talk about a couple of nuts and bolts as far as actually preparing the manuscript itself. So this is kind of the step you'll be taking after you've come up with your speech topic, you've kind of maybe brainstormed some ideas, you have a loose idea of what you want to talk about for your commemorative speech. How do we actually go about putting this into a manuscript format? My recommendation is that you actually start with a basic outline. This is kind of the same thing that you would do for any writing that you do for any class, rather than just kind of sitting down at your keyboard and typing out an entire essay. I know a lot of us do that. We probably shouldn't. Our writing is going to be a lot clearer if we start with kind of this broad structure, have a plan, a basic skeleton to fill in, and then kind of write in more of those specific details. This one seems a little weird, but really speak as you write. So like I said before, it's really easy to have a sentence that looks really good on paper, and then when you actually say it out loud, it just kind of sounds clunky, doesn't quite flow right. So being able to kind of every once in a while just check in, make sure it has the right rhythm or flow that you're going for, can be really beneficial. This is perhaps one of the benefits of us not necessarily being in person teaching, where if you're kind of working in your own space, it's a lot easier to kind of speak out loud, versus if you say you're sitting in the library or just sitting in the LSC, kind of just speaking a sentence out loud every once in a while. At least for me, I know I would be a little self-conscious about doing that, but kind of getting a feel for what your speech sounds like as you're writing it is a good way to get that manuscript prepared. On a similar note, kind of think about the overall rhythm. So what do you want the flow of the speech to be? Do you want it to feel like we're building towards a certain moment? Do you want it to be kind of somber the entire way through? And again, as you're writing and practicing it, think about is my writing matching this overall rhythm that I'm going for? This is really another one of those differences between just informative speaking and commemorative speaking. So if it's informative and you're just kind of giving us the biography of someone, you can just list information. But if you're really trying to, celebrate and, build praise for a person or an institution, you want to think about what the overall kind of feel of the speech is. And so speaking it aloud as you're writing it and kind of getting a feel for that flow can be helpful. And then of course this is the same thing, which is beneficial for all speeches, but especially so for the manuscript. Practice it as much as possible. Really have a good sense of everything that you're going to be saying, so that way you can focus on those delivery techniques as well. And so that starts as you're actually writing the manuscript, kind of getting a sense of what each part is, how it feels, and how it all wants to come together. So these are all kind of some broad considerations just as you're writing. The next thing that I really want to focus on is actually like the manuscript document itself, like the physical piece of paper that you're going to have. This might seem silly, but I think it is worth at least pointing out that even simple things like font size, spacing, color, using different, formatting to mark different sections can be really helpful. If you just, write your speech in Microsoft Word, print it off in, the default 12-point Calibri, and try to read off of that, it can be a little challenging. If you lose your place on there, you might have a hard time getting back. So once you write your speech, it might be helpful to kind of think about, okay, how can I break off, different sentences so that way I know which parts need to go together. Maybe I need to bold certain parts to make sure I remember it. One thing I also like to do if I'm using a manuscript is to write little delivery cues to myself. So, a little reminder to look up to the audience, anything like that. Not sure how well you're able to see these examples. I'll post them online along with this video as well. Obviously the one on the left is a little exaggerated, but if obviously if you're printing stuff in really small font, it can be really difficult to read. Whereas the one on the right, we've kind of increased the size a little bit so it's easier to see as you're giving the speech itself. It's spaced out so that way even if I lose my spot, I'm able to find it again. I've bolded certain sections that really need to be emphasized, and in red I have these delivery cues too. All of this is just to say whatever style or format's going to work for you, just know that even like the physical document itself is a way that you can kind of help yourself as a speaker most effectively convey your ideas. So again, I'll be posting these examples on Canvas for you to take a look at. They're kind of exaggerated and over the top, so don't feel like you have to go to quite this extent, but just know that even though we are doing a manuscript, there's still a lot of a lot of opportunities to customize kind of how you're going to be delivering this yourself. Finally, just as far as the submission itself goes, what is going to get submitted on Canvas, please, even if you have this like really nice formatted version for yourself, just for my own sake, please just kind of give me a simplified version of that. I just need the text version of your speech, so it might help to just like save a separate copy before you start doing all that formatting. And then the main thing, what I'm going to ask is that you're labeling any stylistic devices that you're using, so similes, metaphor, personification. This is optional, but this really helps me to provide kind of more targeted advice and feedback to you. So for instance, if you are trying to use this extended metaphor throughout and you kind of mark it in your manuscript, I'm able to find all those moments and give you feedback on them. So if you do want that type of feedback, please either just use like brackets or parentheses to label the stylistic devices, or just use like the built-in commenting feature in Microsoft Word, for instance, or in Google Docs to kind of mark what's going on where, so that way I can provide detailed feedback for you. Like I said, please just give me a simplified version of your manuscript, not your quote reading manuscript with all those delivery cues or whatnot. That just kind of helps me grade just the speech itself when I'm reading your manuscript, and then I'll grade your delivery based off of that video. So here you go, you can see kind of how everything is labeled a little bit closer up. Again, this is optional, you don't have to do this, but it really helps me. If you'd like, I can provide really targeted feedback for you. And then there's one more there. Alright, so that's kind of everything as far as the manuscript itself goes. What I want to do right now is just kind of quickly touch on a few quick things for our speech assignment itself to keep in mind. So just as a quick reminder, what we're trying to do in this speech, pay tribute to a person, concept, organization, institution, a thing in 4 to 5 minutes. Label any citations if you are using them. This is going to be more the case if like you're not talking about a family member and you're using outside information. Just make sure you're citing everything appropriately. Your speech should be organized according to particular virtues or values, so you don't want to just give us a biography of a person, but really tell us what those praiseworthy characteristics are. And since we are doing commemoration, incorporate stylistic devices as it feels appropriate, but don't feel like you have to kind of like force them in just for the sake of the assignment. So really quickly, virtues or values, this all comes from the textbook reading from last week, but I just want to reiterate it. These are anything, a principle, a standard, a belief that people in general are going to hold as important. So broadly, what we can think of that convoluted definition of virtue is any praiseworthy character trait or characteristic. And it's really important to focus on these virtues, whether it's of your person, of your organization, your institution, and really tell us why that subject of your speech is praiseworthy by these character traits. That way you're giving us a true speech of commemoration and not just some information about this subject. So for instance, rather than just saying, here's what this person did, maybe you can tell us this is why they were really had these virtues of honesty, integrity, strength, and then use that to tell us about what they've done. What I would encourage you to do, if you look on Canvas all the way in one of those last modules of speech resources, there's an entire list of virtues document, so that can be a really helpful starting point if you have some broad ideas about your subject to find some really specific ways to talk about it in a commemorative fashion. And then finally, this idea of stylistic devices, this comes back from chapter 9, so kind of a while back we kind of briefly touched on this. But one of the benefits of a manuscript is that you can really plan out, stylistic language to build eloquence or to have a specific commemorative mood. So things like similes, personification, alliteration, or the word that I always stumble over, parallelism, are all things that you can kind of plan and build into your speech to help build that commemorative mood. If it makes sense, please try to incorporate some of these into your commemorative speech, but like I said, don't try to just like write yourself into a corner trying to force yourself to use, personification or alliteration. They work really well if it works, but if they're kind of in there just for the sake of being there, it can feel clunky. But like I said, if you are using these, please go ahead and just label those on your manuscript, and that way I can provide you specific feedback on how it's working and what my thoughts are. So again, here's all the specific information about our specific speech assignment. You'll have this week and next week to work on researching, writing, practicing, and preparing. I really encourage you to take advantage of as much time as possible in there. Try not to push this off until the very last minute, just to kind of give yourself a chance to really refine this speech and make sure you're genuinely creating praise for whatever your subject is. Our submission process for the speech is going to be the same as all the previous online speeches that we've done. So there will be a discussion post where you can upload that video, and then you're going to be uploading a copy of that manuscript separately to Canvas as well. As always, if there's questions, comments, concerns, whether it's about the speech assignment itself or any of the other content that we've gone over, please don't hesitate to reach out to me either via email, on Microsoft Teams, in my virtual office hours. Just because we are physically distant from one another doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be fully socially disengaged from one another as well, and I want to be able to help you finish up these last assignments as best as I can. So please let me know if there's questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, and until the next time, take care.